Ladies and gentlemen, friends across the world, we stand at a devastating crossroads where the lives of ordinary families, mothers and fathers, children and elders, are being shattered by violence and fear. Tonight, I speak not as a distant observer, but as someone who believes with every fiber of my being that human life is sacred, that justice must be more than a slogan, and that silence in the face of brutality is complicity. There are organizations whose actions have brought unimaginable pain and whose politics have thrived on violence. Those who weaponize ideology to terrorize civilians have no place in civilized governance. They must be held accountable not through vengeance, but through the rule of law, international cooperation, and unrelenting political pressure. The world must close the gaps they exploit: finances, safe havens, propaganda networks, and the systems that allow terror to be normalized. We do not seek revenge, we demand justice. Real justice means dismantling the structures that enable violence through targeted sanctions, lawful prosecutions, international isolation of violent networks, and by cutting off the funding and support that sustain them. Real justice requires the institutions of democracy and law to be strengthened, so that power cannot be seized by fear or by guns. Most of all, justice must protect civilians. Untold numbers of innocent people are paying the price: displaced families, children who will never forget the sound of sirens, mothers who bury their babies. Our first priority must be to stop the suffering of these civilians, to open humanitarian corridors, to protect medical workers, to restore food, water, and shelter, and to ensure aid reaches people who have nothing to do with the politics that brought them harm. We must also invest in solutions that last. That means supporting accountable governance, empowering civil society, promoting education and economic opportunity, and building bridges between communities torn apart by hate. Extremism grows where hope withers. Replace despair with opportunity, and you take away the soil in which terror plants its seeds. The world must act together: democracies, regional powers, the United Nations, and local leaders with clarity and conviction. We must refuse to tolerate double standards and demand consistent application of international law. We must amplify the voices of victims, not the voices of those who would inflame hatred. We must ensure accountability is not selective, and that every crime against civilians is investigated and prosecuted with transparency. To the leaders who still hesitate, remember that strength is not the same as ruthlessness. Courage is found in restraint guided by principle. The gravest mistakes are made when short-term impulses replace long-term wisdom. If we want a safer future, we must build it with institutions and laws that protect the vulnerable, not with cycles of retribution that only breed more violence. To the families who have lost so much, you are not invisible. The world hears you. You deserve truth, reparation, and the certainty that those who planned and carried out atrocities will answer for them. You should not be forced to shoulder grief alone while the powerful look away. And to every citizen listening now, demand that your leaders act humanely and effectively. Demand accountability, transparency, and a strategy that protects lives, preserves rights, and lays the groundwork for lasting peace. Speak for those who cannot speak. Organize for aid. Vote for leaders who choose justice over spectacle. We live in an age where the moral test is simple. Will we allow violence to keep defining our politics, or will we use our collective strength to protect the innocent, enforce the law, and build institutions that prevent the next outrage? Let us choose the harder path, the one of justice, not vengeance, of rebuilding, not razing, of law, not lawlessness. Because a safer world is possible, but only if we refuse to let fear and hatred set the terms. Only if we stand together principled, resolute, humane, until every citizen can sleep without fear, until every child can dream without the sound of explosions in their ears, and until power is won and kept by consent, not by terror. Thank you. Justice is not revenge, it is accountability through law, humanity, and truth. This is more than a phrase, it is a moral compass that must guide every choice we make when trust has been broken and lives have been shattered. When pain is fresh and anger is loud, the temptation to answer brutality with equal force can seem overwhelming. Yet the deepest strength of a society is not proven by how efficiently it punishes. It is proven by how faithfully it upholds principles that protect the vulnerable, hold perpetrators to account, and restore dignity to those who have suffered. Justice demands a tempering of fury with fairness and a refusal to let grief dictate the erosion of law. It requires institutions that are transparent, unbiased, and relentless in their pursuit of truth. These institutions must not be instruments of retaliation, but mechanisms of evidence, process, and rights. When justice is wielded as revenge, it destroys its own legitimacy. Trials become spectacles, punishments become performances, and the line between righteous accountability and vindictive cruelty blurs. Accountability through law means investigations that follow facts wherever they lead, charges prosecuted with meticulous care, and verdicts delivered through systems that respect due process. It means those who commit crimes face consequences because the rule of law demands it, not because it satisfies a thirst for retribution. Humanity must be the soul of every measure we take. Even as we demand consequences, we must protect the dignity of every person affected, the victims, the accused, and the wider communities living under the shadow of violence. To be human in our response is to remember that punishment alone does not heal. Justice must be restorative where possible. Reparations, support for survivors, mental health care, and reconstruction of communities laid waste by terror and strife. Our public discourse should center compassion, ensuring that policy is informed by the faces and stories behind the statistics. Policies shaped by vengeance will always miss the human dimension. Policies shaped by humanity pursue accountability and also insist on care for those left to pick up the pieces. Truth is the indispensable light by which accountability proceeds. Lies, propaganda, and half-truths are weapons that prolong suffering and poison reconciliation. We must cultivate a culture where truth is pursued with courage and protected with clarity. That means protecting journalists, whistleblowers, and independent investigators who risk their lives to bring facts into the open. It means rejecting political convenience when it shields wrongdoing, and demanding transparency from leaders whose decisions determine the fate of millions. A commitment to truth also demands rigorous, impartial inquiry into allegations, and a readiness to accept uncomfortable findings without deflection. Only then can accountability be more than selective blame. It becomes a consistent standard by which all are measured. Accountability also means cutting off the resources and networks that enable violence. Financial flows, arms transfers, and illicit support sustain those who would harm the innocent. Lawful measures to disrupt these channels, sanctions targeted accurately, intelligence shared responsibly, and international cooperation are critical. But even these measures must be governed by law, proportionality, and oversight. When states use the language of justice as cover for aggression or discrimination, trust fractures and solidarity erodes. Therefore, accountability must be principled and consistent. We cannot demand justice in one place while turning a blind eye elsewhere. The moral credibility of our demands depends on even-handedness. In pursuing justice, we must be mindful of the long arc between an immediate response and a durable peace. Quick, punitive actions can provide the illusion of control while planting the seeds for future cycles of violence. Enduring accountability is strategic. It combines legal action with political solutions, humanitarian relief, and efforts to address the grievances that allowed extremism to grow. That is not an excuse for delay. It is a recognition that justice, to be meaningful, must also be sustainable. Measures that restore safety today must also build institutions and opportunities that deny tomorrow's radicals the conditions they need to recruit and terrorize. This is why global cooperation matters. No single nation can untangle the knots of transnational networks, nor can it impose justice unilaterally without risking abuses of power. The United Nations, regional bodies and coalitions of states must be brought into the work of investigating crimes, coordinating sanctions, and delivering aid. Civil society organizations and local leaders must have space to participate. Justice that is broadly owned, transparent, and anchored in international norms carries far more weight than measures enacted in isolation or secrecy. Shared standards and shared scrutiny protect against the manipulation of justice for narrow interests and reinforce the legitimacy of accountability. Public engagement is essential. Citizens must insist that their governments honor human rights even when tempted by expediency. Activism, voting, and public accountability are the arteries through which democratic responsibility flows. When people demand fair investigations, transparent courts, and humane treatment of prisoners, they shield institutions from becoming tools of vengeance. A vigilant public is the best safeguard against the weaponization of justice. Education about rights, about the rule of law, and about the human cost of violent cycles builds resilience in societies and strengthens the social fabric that justice must protect. We must also invest in prevention, economic development, education, inclusion, and dialogue that bridge sectarian or ethnic divides. Extremism grows where institutions fail and where hope is absent. Justice, in the fullest sense, includes the work of building societies where grievances can be aired and resolved without violence. Investing in social safety nets, supporting local leadership, and fostering civic spaces will not eliminate all evil overnight, but they will make communities less vulnerable to those who promise belonging through hate. Lastly, let us not confuse the language of strength with the language of cruelty. Strength that demonstrates moral clarity and restraint is harder, truer strength than that which seeks gratification through destruction. Accountability through law, humanity, and truth does not make us weak. It defines us as a society capable of rising above base retaliation. It gives victims the legitimacy of being heard and ensures that those who harm are brought to account in a manner that preserves the values we claim to protect. We owe this to future generations who will inherit the world we shape today. Our actions now will either normalize the abuse of power or enshrine the standards that prevent it. Choosing justice over vengeance is a choice to teach children that laws protect the weak and that truth has consequences. When justice is delivered with compassion and rigor, it breaks cycles of hatred and creates the conditions for reconciliation to begin. This obligation is not abstract, it is a moral, legal, and civic duty that binds us together in common purpose. Let us therefore commit ourselves to the painstaking work of accountability, to the patient defense of rights, and to the unyielding pursuit of truth for everyone's sake. Civilians must never be collateral. Their protection is our first duty. This idea is simple and savage in its clarity. In any conflict, the lives of ordinary people, mothers holding infants, shopkeepers sweeping their porches at dawn, students returning from class are not acceptable sacrifices for political goals or military advantage. When warfare or political violence treats civilians as mere impediments to be tolerated, the moral contract that binds a society unravels. Protecting civilians is not an optional humanitarian add-on. It is the baseline of any legitimate policy, the test by which power proves its conscience. To say that civilians must not be collateral is to insist that every strategy, every plan, every order be measured against the single metric of human safety. The urgency of this duty becomes painfully real when we think of the ordinary rhythms of life shattered by conflict. Markets emptied, clinics overwhelmed, schools turned into shelters. Civilians bear not only the immediate trauma of bombs and bullets, but the slow violence of displacement, hunger, and disease. When we speak of protection, we must think beyond physical safety to the preservation of dignity, ensuring that people have access to medical care, food, clean water, and the means to rebuild their lives. A protected civilian is not just someone who survives an attack. They are someone whose human needs are met, whose rights are respected, and whose voice is counted in the rebuilding that follows. Effective protection requires clear rules and unwavering enforcement. International humanitarian law exists precisely because the chaos of conflict needs guardrails, clear prohibitions against targeting civilians, defined obligations for occupying powers, and mechanisms for accountability when rules are broken. But laws are inert unless backed by political will. Governments, militaries, and international organizations must operationalize these rules so that they become routines, part of the planning, part of the training, and part of the command chain. That means preemptive planning for civilian evacuation routes, careful targeting protocols that minimize harm, and rapid response teams ready to deliver aid-the-moment security permits. It means governments refusing to accept collateralization as a cost of doing business. Transparency and independent monitoring are essential to hold those in power accountable to this duty. Independent observers, journalists, and humanitarian agencies play a vital role in documenting abuses and ensuring that violations are not hidden. When investigations are blocked, when access is denied, the suffering of civilians becomes invisible and therefore easier to rationalize. Open reporting, satellite imagery, and impartial inquiries make it harder for abuses to be dismissed as fog-of-war anomalies. A society that values civilian protection must protect those who expose wrongdoing and must allow scrutiny to operate freely and without fear. Beyond law and monitoring, protecting civilians demands a recalibration of military doctrine and tactics. Modern warfare often conflates enemy and environment in ways that place non-combatants at extreme risk. Precision must be pursued not as a slogan, but as a discipline, investing in intelligence that distinguishes combatants from civilians, applying stringent collateral, damage estimates, and choosing operations whose benefit outweighs the potential harm to non-combatants. When rapid strikes or scorched earth tactics are justified by expediency, the immediate tactical gain often produces strategic loss, radicalized survivors, broken communities, and a legacy of grievance that outlives any temporary victory. True strategic wisdom recognizes that preserving civilian life preserves the possibility of reconciliation and long-term stability. Humanitarian access must be protected as a sacrosanct principle. Aid workers, medical personnel, and relief convoys are lifelines, not bargaining chips. Denying access to food, medicine, or shelter as a tool of warfare is an assault on the most basic human rights. Those who facilitate and protect humanitarian operations through safe corridors, agreements with military actors, and protection of medical facilities perform some of the most essential work in conflict zones. Rules and norms must expressly prohibit the use of humanitarian aid as leverage, and violators must face legal and diplomatic consequences. Ensuring safe passage for relief is a moral imperative and a practical necessity to prevent mass suffering. Civilians reflect the diversity of a society. Their protection cannot be selective. Discrimination, whether on the basis of ethnicity, religion, political affiliation, or class, paves the way for atrocities to be rationalized. Policies that claim to protect some while abandoning others destroy the ethical foundation of any response. Equal protection under crisis conditions must be the standard. This equality is not merely rhetorical. It must be visible in the distribution of aid, the prioritization of evacuations, and the impartial application of justice. The role of the international community is critical. When a state cannot or will not protect its people, neighboring countries, regional organizations, and global institutions must step in with concerted, lawful measures. Diplomatic pressure, targeted sanctions, and coordinated humanitarian operations can create the conditions for civilian safety without resorting to indiscriminate force. Multilateral coalitions can share intelligence, open supply lines, and provide refuge to those fleeing danger. Yet intervention must always be guided by clear legal mandates and respect for sovereignty, calibrated to maximize protection while minimizing harm. Finally, the civic responsibility of ordinary people must not be overlooked. Advocacy, humanitarian volunteering, and the pressure of public opinion matter. Citizens in democratic societies must demand that their leaders prioritize life over facile displays of strength. Empathy must translate into policy, and outrage must be channeled into sustained action. Support for relief organizations, lobbying for protective measures, and voting for leaders who understand that moral clarity requires practical commitment. Protecting civilians is not sentimental, it is strategic and moral. It preserves the moral integrity of action, prevents the amplification of hatred, and keeps open the fragile door to reconciliation and recovery. When we declare that civilians must never be collateral, we are making a promise to the most vulnerable, that their lives will not be reduced to statistics, that their suffering will not be a footnote to strategic calculus, and that every policy choice will be weighed against the imperative to safeguard human life